Yeah, I'm doing a presentation on family values. I'm really actually plugging this book by Melinda Cooper, Family Values Between Neoliberalism and New Social Conservatism, and really wanted to highlight some of the stuff that she covers. The reading that we did, that people hopefully did, kind of documents the early history of the family under capitalism, the emergence of the welfare state, how the patriarchal family formation is extremely useful for instilling values that maintain the capitalist order. Melinda Cooper's book is going to kind of it kind of ends at World War II. That reading did, and I wanted to kind of pick up there. And Cooper's book follows the history of neoliberal and new social conservative thought and how family values discourse has been a main focus of kind of shaping a lot of policies and so yeah, post-World War II America is described as a time of prosperity and growth, and it really was for the white nuclear family. We had expanded New Deal programs that created normative categories that really excluded Black Americans and countless other marginalized groups while privileging the white male breadwinner household. This factor, a multitude of others, really set the ground for a lot of radical movements of the 1960s and 70s, as well as the emergence of neoliberal and new social conservative thought. So yeah, kind of defined neoliberalism, developed during the mid-20th century in the University of Chicago and in Virginia. It upholds the individualistic values of the free market order, claims that state welfare, social insurance create perverse incentives that disturb the free market equilibrium. It's had a profound influence on government policy since the 70s and has been, quote, accepted among policymakers of all political stripes and thoroughly disseminated throughout mainstream economics. They focus on the family as like a spontaneous source of welfare in the free market order. They claim that redistributive programs prevent the family from resuming its role in providing care. This was really greatly motivated by changing family structures, especially the breakdown of kind of that Fordist family in which like a white male industrial unionized worker provided all the necessary income for him and his family. And they were really concerned with the costs to like the taxpayer and the public incurred by non-contributing groups, like people living with mental illness, single mothers. During the AIDS epidemic, they were focused on gay men and their risky behavior, and how that risky sexual behavior incurred costs that the public should not be responsible for, that the family should ultimately be responsible for. And they essentially redefined, quote, the intellectual and popular consensus around state deficit spending, the role of central bank, inflation, taxation, tuition fees, and welfare. New social conservatism is an interesting and diverse political response to kind of the same progressive trends of the 1970s. They have a different kind of take on welfare, seeing it as something that should maintain the family structure, that the government's role is to kind of protect the family formation from big business and corporate greed and things like that. It's a really interesting composition. It's made of kind of this group was made of like previously opposed Christian denominations that kind of coalesced around the like Roe versus Wade issue and the abortion rights struggle, but also like a lot of New Deal Democrats really kind of aligned themselves with this tendency, as well as, interestingly, Cooper says some Trotskyists actually kind of joined up with the new social conservatives, which I don't know, she didn't say much about it. So yeah, they were very focused on the family. They're focused on fatherless families. They're worried about the rising roles of women in the workforce, and see the family as like a shortcut to social mobility. So sorry, I'm gonna hit you with a quote. If the history of modern capital on the one hand appears on the one hand to regularly undermine and challenging existing orders of gender and sexuality, it also entails a periodic reinvention of the family as an instrument for distributing wealth and income. Thus, according to Riva Siegel, the legal history of the modern family can be understood as a process of preservation through transformation rather than one of progressive liberalization, where challenges to establish gender and generational hierarchies are, sorry, this is, my screen's partially blocked, recaptured within new, more democratic, but no less implaceable legal structures. So yeah, these ideologies have kind of appeared to be opposed throughout history, but they must, quote, be thought together in their convergences, collisions, and symbiosis if we are to understand the political rationality of power in the US today. Neoliberalism is supposed to revolve around individualism, but they also ultimately must, quote, delegate power to social conservatives in order to realize their vision of like a spontaneously self-sufficient family. So yeah, that idea of like this family spontaneously emerging from the free market is really not grounded in reality, and it requires like government programs to maintain. So going forward, I'm kind of going to document some of the stuff that led up to like the rise of neoliberal thought. Inflation was a big issue in the 1970s. We had Cold War military expenditure, social welfare programs, and struggles in colonized countries whose labor we depended on, their cheap labor. What was really unique about this time was that there were working class movements, strong unions, social welfare programs that really kept wages consistent with inflation. And those factors really posed a big threat to the investing class, really weakened the role of inherited wealth. And so ultimately what's interesting, and Cooper talks about this a lot, is this focus on the AFDC, or the Aid to Families with Dependent Children. This represented like a super small percentage of like expenditure on welfare, but it got a lot of focus. I guess we can look back and see that it originated to kind of assist single mothers and widows, but in the post-war era, it led to the inclusion of Black women, and it became like a highly racialized program that a lot of people focused on. They called it, they said it encouraged out of wedlock birth and incentivized single mothers to remain unemployed. Really, the stigmatization was also kind of like reflected in the poor funding of the program itself. And it had very restrictive allocation of benefits. And we can see like man in the house laws and employable mother laws being used to employable mother laws essentially designated Black women as indispensable workers and excluded them from lots of social welfare. So it was really forcing them into domestic service in white households, things like that. I guess as we move, another big factor in this kind of sentiment that was being developed around net welfare, this very negative sentiment, we can look at the Moynihan Report. And this also really fueled a lot of this negative discourse around single Black mothers, but it focused on divorce, separation, out of wedlock birth, female-headed families as the cause of like the degradation of the Black family. Moynihan said he claimed that slavery had, quote, destroyed the proper order of gender relations in the African American family. And the report was met with some backlash, but ultimately this shift in sentiment was reflected on both sides of the aisle, and in terms of attitudes towards welfare. Really at the time, there were some like welfare activists that had like a really good analysis of like the structural forms of oppression that single mothers were facing. And they actually made some considerable gains for single mothers at a certain point, but they were only short-lived because this sentiment had already shifted towards trying to basically include Black men in the like male breadwinner, the breadwinner wage, as they called it. So yeah, Cooper states here, quote, "It was not so much women's dependence on the state that provoked outrage. It was rather the growing realization that welfare was making women independent of individual men and freeing them from the obligations of the family." this report really it influenced Nixon's attempt at establishing the Family Assistance Program. This was designed to phase out the AFDC, and it was a really weak program that had a lot of weak and damaging policies, and it kind of was dead on arrival. But it was at this point an extraordinary, quote, consensus that had formed around the project of the expanded family wage. It came apart and reshuffled into distinct political positions. And so Cooper kind of locates this as like a crucial point in the birth of like neoliberalism and new social conservatism. Another factor was this tax. Wealth inequality had been eroding through all these welfare programs and different progressive trends. And, you know, it was really hard for conservatives to figure out how to garner support for fighting back against these trends. And just defending the capitalist class was not like an effective measure. So they really used a lot of, they framed them as these trends as like a threat to meritocracy, entrepreneurship, innovation, competition, all these kind of bourgeois ideals. And then really brought a lot of focus to the estate tax, which was just a tax on inherited wealth. And they rallied a lot of white middle-class homeowners around an attack on this estate tax, which really only affected the highest classes of society. Sorry, excuse me. So yeah, at this point, quote, the white middle class effectively refashioned itself in the image of the investment class and sought it to exempt itself from forms of social redistribution that were commonly denounced as subsidies to the family dysfunction of the poor. It's really interesting to observe this shift because a lot of the people leading this charge against social welfare were actually beneficiaries of like New Deal programs that have definitely been like termed as affirmative action for white people, interestingly. But it's also important to look at, you know, we understand redlining as another big part of the New Deal policies, but it also is important, and I think this is, Cooper pointed this out from so well, quote, these policies were not simply racializing, but they were also tightly bound up with the normative regulation of gender and sexuality. They erected a social and spatial closet around normative heterosexuality, creating suburban spaces in which homosexuality could only be lived in secret, and by the same token, urban spaces in which single homosexual whites congregated as an increasingly distinct social demographic along the non-white core. And so, yeah, this was another major shift in sentiment towards these progressive trends, the new left, kind of anti-normative radical movements. And this brings us to the Volcker shock and the rise of Reagan. This guy became the chair of the Federal Reserve in 1978, and he immediately implemented monetary policies that produced the deepest recession since the Great Depression. Double-digit unemployment rates, all kinds of horrible shit going on in that period. And quote, having thus broken the bargaining power of unionized labor, this laid the ground for a long-term restructuring of the U.S. labor market. You know, this is where we saw a lot of deindustrialization, manufacturers moving production units offshore. It was a big shift. Then we also have this asshole, Reagan. He kind of arose in the 1970s. He was governor of California. He was one of the first people to combine the quote neoliberal thematics of family self-sufficient agenda of moral reform. And as president, he introduced fiscal policy that paired with Volcker's monetary policy. This reversed the redistributive trends of the 1970s and really created the wage stagnation and expanding wealth inequality that we've been experiencing for the last 50 years. And that's kind of gotten us to where we are now. And yeah, these trends were also greatly exacerbated by cuts to healthcare, education, social services, and the idea was to shift costs back to the private family or the private individual, and kind of force them into like this logic of debt accumulation. And this also, the Reagan presidency coincided with the started the AIDS epidemic, or like really when it came into the public eye. He had immediately passed the Omnibus Reconciliation Act, cutting funding to state healthcare. And yeah, essentially this called for the reinstitutionalization of the private family, church, and charity as natural conduits for self-care. And obviously, lots of people don't have that access to that support system. So this forced grassroots activists to organize laborers to deal with the unpaid laborers to deal with the crisis. The Reagan administration had also talked about defunding public welfare and shifting focus more to a nonprofit sector. They really favored conservative religious charities and nonprofits, and really ignored the orgs that were intimately involved with this. And Cooper's like documentation of this whole period is just like completely shattering. I had a hard time. There were a few things that like really stood out to me, and how this influenced the LGBTQ rights movement. The moral panic around the AIDS epidemic. Someone says that, quote, it is the devastating historical accident that HIV was first noticed among well cared for gay men, because women and intravenous drug users had been dealing with this all throughout the 1970s. It produced a different set of symptoms for women, which was, and especially poor women who were experiencing this, who were uninsured. And when we look back at 1970s medical records, there were large numbers of poor women who were dying of AIDS. It was really only because these middle class, like healthy gay men that had decent insurance that covered their screenings, and it kind of, that's why they became so visible to the public, because they were one of the only demographics that was able to that it was identifiable in, at least in the medical field at that time. Sorry, that was poorly said, but yeah, this happened at a time of rampant homophobia, obviously, and created a lot of stigma around the disease. And we can see Reagan's inaction up until like I think 85. He completely ignored the crisis while countless people were dying. And even after he took action, low-income HIV-infected women were excluded for all forms of social insurance, until like the activism of like the ACT UP org, which demanded that the CDC expand its definition of recognizable AIDS. And yeah, I guess these activists were originally kind of fighting for insurance benefits for like specific classes of employees who were being denied access to AIDS treatment. But other marginalized groups within this org experienced, quote, their outright exclusion from the healthcare system as a much more complex collusion of sexual, race, and class factors. This led to kind of like an expanded horizons for the org, but they were very controversial and led to its dissolution. And this really had this precipitated a major shift in the LGBTQ rights movement, which I'm going to kind of end with. Next is Clinton. Yeah, he introduced the PRWRA. He abolished the AFDC, and his, quote, landmark legislation sought as far as possible to replace public responsibility for the welfare of poor women with state-enforced private family responsibility. Yeah, he shifted focus to extracting child support from fathers, welfare, and ultimately this reform served to remind women that an individual man, not the state, was ultimately responsible for their economic security. So yeah, the Clinton administration was kind of like the embodiment of neoliberalism, and like new wave Democrats who really were trying to distance themselves from the anti-normative new left, and they really were trying to regain support from the white middle class. And Clinton did to welfare what Reagan essentially wanted to do. People say that he kind of destroyed it, but Cooper points out that it was more of he reinvigorated welfare, quote, as an instrument for imposing work and family obligations on the welfare poor. Yeah, this transformation of welfare, quote, drastically restricted public assistance to impoverished single mothers, and made marriage promotion and family responsibility the centerpiece of social policy for the poor. This is, the kind of final blow to some of the decent welfare programs of the 1970s. And so, like I was talking about earlier with ACT UP and their expanded political horizons and how that kind of led to their dissolution, that reflected these shrinking political horizons, led same-sex marriage activists, I think, quote, to look to the surviving remnants of the family wage, which were social insurance benefits premised on marital and familial status. So they argued that they should be included in this last vestige of Fordist normative. I cannot read part of this, and I should have been reading quotes off the screen, but it shifted a focus to gay marriage. They wanted to be included in the family wage, which didn't really exist, and it wanted access to the benefits of being included in this normative category, instead of really looking beyond those categories. And you can see how, like, I guess ultimately these developments all throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s have led a lot of these movements to really focus on expanded inclusion in these normative categories, instead of, like I said, a politics that look beyond these like structures entirely. I guess ultimately this book, I just think helps us like really historicize where we're at politically today. It helps us historicize the current political landscape. She covers all kinds of other issues that I just couldn't even get to, in terms of like the slashing of public healthcare, and the rise of like student debt, slashing of public education funding and the rise of student debt. Countless other issues. And I think it's really important to have an understanding of this history in terms of like, sorry, I'm going in circles. I guess I'm just going to end. I'm looking forward to talking about all this stuff. Hope this wasn't too long. Thanks, y'all.